The door didn't creak or crack or protest the way old wood usually does. It detonated inward, like it had been struck with intent. One moment the State Attorney General was mid-sentence at my grandfather's table, calmly explaining the reach of state racketeering statutes, and the next, the front of my cabin no longer existed. 100 years of pine splintered into the room, fragments skidding across the floor, as sunlight and cold air rushed in, uninvited. Standing in the wreckage was HOA Karen, feet planted like she'd just conquered territory, phone raised high, and already recording. She wasn't shocked by what she'd done. She was energized by it, eyes bright with the certainty that spectacle would protect her. Her entrance wasn't a mistake. It was a performance, staged for the audience she'd trained to believe her noise equaled authority. She had been live-streaming her harassment for months, weaponizing attention, and now she'd dragged that circus straight into my home. This was supposed to be her final act, the moment she proved she still controlled the narrative. She had no idea she'd just walked into evidence. Her voice cut through the dust like a siren, shrill and rehearsed, already shaping the story for the people watching through their screens. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? She screamed about unauthorized meetings, about HOA jurisdiction, about her right to enforce rules on what she called community property. Each word was delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been meaningfully challenged. She demanded explanations while standing in a cabin that existed decades before her association was even an idea. Her certainty wasn't loud because it was strong. It was loud because it was fragile. Across from her, the Attorney General didn't move. She didn't raise her voice or correct a single accusation. She simply set her coffee down on top of the evidence binders, stacked neatly on the table. That stillness was the first thing HOA Karen failed to understand. People like her expect resistance or fear, not observation. Silence unsettles predators more than confrontation ever could. HOA Karen stepped farther inside, shoes crunching over shattered wood, acting as if destruction itself validated her authority. She angled her phone to make sure the camera caught everything, narrating in real time as though she were exposing corruption instead of committing it. She accused us of conspiracies, of collusion, of harassment, every word designed to inflame the invisible crowd watching. What that crowd couldn't see was the tally forming in my head with each passing second. Trespass, forced entry, destruction of property, intimidation of a public official. And because she was broadcasting it all across state lines, a federal charge gift-wrapped on top. She didn't know any of that mattered yet. In her mind, she was confronting a retired old man in a fishing cabin. She didn't see the 30 years I'd spent dismantling financial crimes for the Department of Justice. She didn't recognize the posture of someone who had built entire cases out of calmer moments than this. She mistook my lack of reaction for confusion. She mistook the Attorney General's composure for weakness. Arrogance does that. It rewrites reality until the rewrite collapses. The Attorney General finally spoke, her voice even and precise, asking HOA Karen to lower her voice and her camera. It wasn't a threat or a plea, it was a professional courtesy. HOA Karen laughed, sharp and dismissive, declaring she was the governing authority here. The delusion was almost impressive. She was standing inside a private residence, screaming jurisdiction at a woman whose reach extended far beyond her comprehension. Her eyes darted between us, searching for fear, for hesitation, for anything that would feed her momentum. She found none. The room felt suspended, like everyone present understood something irreversible was unfolding, even if HOA Karen didn't. Dust still hung in the air from the shattered door. The lake outside was silent. Her voice was the only thing moving, and even that was starting to fray. She took another step forward, shoving the phone closer, demanding names and explanations for her audience. She announced that the people had a right to know what was happening in her community. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so expensive for her. The Attorney General reached into her jacket, slow and deliberate, and for a fraction of a second, HOA Karen's expression flickered. She thought escalation was coming. What came instead was a badge. The shift was immediate and devastating. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a recalibration of reality that HOA Karen's brain struggled to process. The Attorney General stated her name and her office without raising her voice. She informed HOA Karen that she was under arrest with the same tone someone uses to state the time. No flourish, no satisfaction. Just fact. The phone in HOA Karen's hand kept streaming as her mouth opened and closed, searching for a script that no longer applied. 6 months earlier, this moment would have seemed impossible. Back then, HOA Karen was just another power-drunk tyrant circling the edges of my quiet retirement. I had come to the cabin to disappear, not to fight. I believed I had earned silence after a career spent inside criminal systems. I thought I was done being useful. I was wrong. The crash of that door wasn't the start of the story. It was the moment everything she'd built collapsed into the open. What followed wasn't chaos. It was inevitability, finally catching up. 6 months before that door exploded inward, my life was quiet, in the way only people who have lived through noise can truly appreciate. I didn't wake up to alarms or deadlines anymore. I woke up to water moving against wood and light coming through old glass at its own pace. I had chosen that cabin deliberately, not as a retreat born of weakness, but as a reward earned through endurance. For 30 years, my professional life had been spent inside the anatomy of other people's lies, tracing their greed through numbers until the story collapsed under its own weight. Retirement wasn't escape for me, it was closure. My name is Frank Miller, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a forensic accountant for the Department of Justice. It wasn't glamorous work, and it wasn't fast. There were no dramatic confrontations or cinematic victories. There were spreadsheets, bank statements, shell companies layered inside shell companies, and long nights spent following money that criminals believed had vanished. My job was never to accuse or threaten. My job was to prove. I built cases slowly and precisely, the kind that didn't rely on testimony or emotion, only on facts that refused to move no matter how hard someone pushed back. People who went to prison because of my work didn't get there because I yelled louder than them. They got there because numbers don't lie, and patterns don't forget. Over the years, I worked cases that ranged from organized crime construction rackets to corporate fraud schemes that siphoned billions from pension funds. The scale changed, the players changed, but the psychology never did. Every criminal eventually believes they're smarter than the system. Every one of them gets careless. They reuse structures. They trust family. They assume no one is paying attention. And every single time, that arrogance leaves a trail. I was paid to walk those trails to their end. When I retired, I didn't want a golf course or a condominium. I wanted silence that didn't feel temporary. The only place that offered that was my grandfather's cabin on Clearwater Lake. He built it in the 1950s with his own hands, a structure of hand-hewn logs and stone meant to last longer than trends or committees. But the real genius of that place wasn't the craftsmanship, it was the paperwork. My grandfather, Thomas Miller, had been a state surveyor, a man who understood land and law with equal clarity. When he acquired that property, he negotiated protections most people never think to ask for. Because the land bordered a state preserve, he worked directly with the state to place it under a conservation easement that answered upward, not locally. That meant the property wasn't subject to future municipal overreach or neighborhood associations that didn't yet exist. It was protected by statute, not preference. On top of that, the deed granted primary riparian rights extending into the lake itself, rights established decades before luxury development ever touched the shoreline. In simple terms, my dock, my water access, and my stretch of shoreline were legally inseparable from the property. They couldn't be regulated away by an HOA vote or a policy change. My grandfather had built a legal fortress and then walked away from it, confident it would hold. For the first months of my retirement, it was everything I'd hoped for. I fished from the same dock he'd built. I restored stonework one piece at a time. I sat on the porch and watched the lake change color without thinking about anything else. The neighbors were people who remembered my family, people who valued quiet as much as I did. Eleanor Gable, a retired history teacher who lived down the shore, brought me bread once a week and stories from a time before the lake was fashionable. She told me more than once that my grandfather had been a man who noticed everything without announcing it. She wasn't wrong. I've never been loud. In my experience, the loudest person in the room is usually compensating for the weakest position. Authority doesn't come from volume, it comes from inevitability. You don't need to threaten when you can prove. That mindset never left me when I retired. It just went dormant, waiting for a reason to wake up. HOA Karen never asked what I did before I moved back to the lake. People like her never do. They see age and quiet and assume submission. They mistake isolation for vulnerability and stillness for ignorance. When she arrived in the community with her polished confidence and immediate need to control everything around her, she cataloged people quickly. Who would comply? Who would resist? Who could be pressured into silence? When her eyes eventually landed on my cabin, she didn't see a former federal investigator. She saw an obstacle that looked manageable. The authority I carried into that confrontation didn't come from anger or revenge. It came from experience and preparation layered over decades. By the time HOA Karen decided to test me, I had already spent a lifetime dismantling people who thought power insulated them from consequence. I just hadn't expected to do it again from a fishing cabin. HOA Karen didn't take control of Clearwater Lake Estates by accident. She didn't inherit power, and she didn't stumble into leadership through goodwill or competence. She engineered it. When she arrived, the association was little more than a volunteer committee that argued about dock maintenance and holiday decorations. Meetings were informal, sparsely attended, and largely ignored because nothing truly threatening ever came out of them. That kind of structure is easy to hijack if you understand one basic truth. Most people avoid conflict until it's already too late. She started small, the way predators always do. She volunteered for everything: compliance review, records management, communications. She positioned herself as the only person willing to do the work no one else had time for. People were relieved to hand responsibility over to someone who looked organized and sounded confident. Within months, she controlled the meeting agendas, the mailing lists, and the documentation. Authority followed access, and she made sure she had all of it. Once she became president, the HOA stopped behaving like a community organization and started behaving like a private enforcement arm. The bylaws were updated without meaningful discussion, rewritten in dense legal language designed to intimidate rather than clarify. Vague clauses about aesthetics and safety were expanded into discretionary powers that gave the board authority to fine first and explain later. HOA Karen didn't want clear rules. Clear rules limit power. She wanted ambiguity she could weaponize. Her enforcement strategy was simple and ruthless. She created a constant state of low-level fear by issuing violation notices that were technically disputable but emotionally exhausting to fight. Grass too tall by an undefined margin. Paint not matching an approved palette that no one could actually access. Dock features suddenly classified as hazards without explanation. Each notice carried a fine small enough to seem cheaper to pay than to contest. Individually, they felt petty. Collectively, they formed a pressure system designed to break people quietly. The real abuse came in the escalation. Anyone who challenged a fine became a target. HOA Karen kept meticulous records, not to ensure fairness, but to build narratives. A resident who questioned one violation would suddenly receive multiple inspections. Their name would appear repeatedly in meeting minutes under phrases like ongoing non-compliance and pattern of resistance. Language mattered to her. She understood that once you define someone as a problem on paper, everything you do to them afterward feels justified. She was particularly effective against the elderly and those living on fixed incomes. They didn't have the energy or resources to hire attorneys, and she knew it. Fines accumulated, late fees compounded, legal notices followed. Eventually, the HOA would place liens on properties, a process she fast-tracked by claiming urgent financial harm to the community. What she framed as enforcement was, in practice, extraction. Behind the scenes, the power structure was even uglier. HOA Karen didn't act alone. Her board was composed of people she had personally selected, not for competence, but for compliance. Some were flattered by proximity to power. Others were intimidated into silence. Financial oversight was deliberately obscured. Requests to review contracts or invoices were delayed, redirected, or denied under the pretense of confidentiality. Transparency was treated as a threat. The most profitable tool in her arsenal was the emergency assessment. Declared without independent review, these assessments bypassed standard voting procedures by invoking imminent danger, shoreline erosion, environmental risk, infrastructure instability. The language was always urgent and alarming, designed to shut down questions before they formed. Residents were told that failure to pay would result in immediate penalties or legal action. Fear did the rest. The money flowed quickly and quietly. Large sums collected from residents were transferred to outside contractors without competitive bidding. The same names appeared repeatedly, often tied by family or personal connections. Work was vaguely described and rarely verified. Some projects never materialized at all. Others consisted of minimal effort billed at premium rates. The association's reserves ballooned and then drained without clear accounting. Anyone who asked where the money went was accused of undermining community trust. Public humiliation was another favored tactic. HOA meetings became performance spaces where dissenters were cut off, mocked, or dismissed as ignorant. HOA Karen mastered the art of procedural dominance, citing rules to silence questions while ignoring those same rules when they constrained her. She controlled the microphone, the minutes, and the narrative. Residents learned quickly that speaking up came at a cost. Social isolation completed the cycle. Through newsletters and private online groups, she framed enforcement actions as necessary defenses against selfish individuals. Names were rarely mentioned, but descriptions were specific enough to make targets obvious. Neighbors were encouraged to see each other as risks rather than allies. The community fractured into observers and survivors, each hoping not to be next. By the time HOA Karen's attention settled on my cabin, this system was fully operational. She had spent years refining it, testing boundaries, and learning exactly how far she could push without immediate backlash. She had conditioned the community to accept abuse as normal governance. To her, my property wasn't just non-compliant, it was defiant. And defiance, in her structure, was something that had to be crushed publicly to maintain control. What she never understood was that systems built on intimidation collapse when exposed to scrutiny. Abuse thrives in darkness and confusion. It depends on people believing they're alone. HOA Karen had spent years perfecting a machine that extracted money and obedience from people who didn't know how to fight back. When she turned that machine toward me, she assumed I would react the same way everyone else had. She assumed wrong. The moment HOA Karen crossed from administrative abuse into direct intimidation against my property, the situation stopped being a nuisance and became an investigation. I didn't react emotionally, because emotion clouds sequence, and sequence is everything when you're dismantling a system built on paperwork and lies. I reacted the same way I had for decades in my professional life, by documenting, correlating, and isolating patterns until intent became undeniable. Every notice she sent, every email, every altered rule, every selectively enforced clause became data. And data, when aligned correctly, tells the truth whether the people involved wanted to or not. I began with the paperwork she thought protected her. HOA violation notices are designed to look authoritative, but most people never read past the bolded fines and deadlines. I did, line by line, citation by citation. What immediately stood out was inconsistency. Clauses referenced sections of the bylaws that no longer existed or had been renumbered years earlier. Dates didn't align with adoption records. Enforcement language had been copy-pasted from templates that didn't match our governing documents. That alone didn't prove fraud, but it proved sloppiness. And sloppiness is where cracks form. From there, I requested official HOA records under state statute, financial disclosures, vendor contracts, meeting minutes. By law, they were required to comply. In practice, HOA Karen delayed, deflected, and partially complied, which is exactly what people do when they're hiding something. The records I did receive were incomplete, but even incomplete records tell stories if you know where to look. Payment logs showed large transfers labeled as environmental mitigation, with no corresponding inspection reports. Contractor invoices lacked itemization. Approval votes appeared in minutes for meetings that never achieved quorum. It was governance theater, and the props were starting to fall apart. The turning point came when I compared HOA financial records with county filings. Public records are unforgiving. They don't care about narratives. They care about timestamps, ownership, and signatures. That's when I found the shell. One of the primary contractors receiving HOA funds was a limited liability company registered out of state, with no employees and no operational footprint. The registered agent was a forwarding service. The mailing address led to a strip mall. On paper, it looked legitimate enough to pass casual scrutiny. Under forensic review, it was hollow. Tracing the ownership chain took time, but patience is an advantage when the other side assumes you'll give up. The LLC tied back to a trust. The trust tied back to a family name, and that name tied directly to HOA Karen through marriage. It wasn't subtle. It was arrogant. She had assumed no one would ever bother connecting the dots. She was right about most people. She was wrong about me. At the same time, I began documenting selective enforcement. I photographed neighboring properties with identical features that had never been cited. Docks built later than mine with fewer permits. Structures closer to the waterline that somehow passed inspection. I logged dates, measurements, and photographs with metadata intact. Patterns emerged quickly. Enforcement wasn't about compliance. It was about leverage. The rules existed to be ignored until they were useful as weapons. Then came the land records. This is where everything shifted from harassment to motive. My cabin sits on land with protections that predate the HOA by decades. Easements, conservation clauses, riparian rights, all recorded, all enforceable, and all inconvenient to anyone looking to consolidate shoreline control. When I pulled recent zoning proposals and development interest filings, the picture snapped into focus. There was a planned expansion, luxury construction, shoreline modification, and my property sat directly in the way. The harassment wasn't random, it was strategic. Fines escalate, liens follow, forced sales come next. I had seen this playbook before, just not wearing an HOA badge. What HOA Karen was running wasn't just abuse of authority. It was a slow-motion asset acquisition scheme, disguised as community governance. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that she wasn't operating alone. Emails obtained through lawful request showed coordination with external parties. Language shifted from enforcement to acquisition. Phrases like problem parcels and resolution timeline appeared where compliance language should have been. This wasn't about lawns or docks. It was about control. Control of land, control of access, control of money. I compiled everything meticulously. Every document was logged, cross-referenced, and preserved. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn her. Confrontation alerts predators. Evidence buries them. By the time I finished, the file wasn't just convincing. It was complete. Financial fraud, conflict of interest, selective enforcement, coercive pressure designed to force property surrender. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a case. And once you have proof that's solid, the next phase isn't anger. It's timing. The confrontation didn't begin with shouting or threats, because real collapses never do. They begin with overconfidence. HOA Karen believed she had already won, and that belief made her careless in ways no amount of authority could protect her from. She scheduled the emergency HOA meeting with theatrical urgency, framing it as a necessary step to restore order to a community supposedly under threat. The language was deliberate. She wanted fear in the room before anyone even arrived. Fear makes people compliant, and compliance had been her currency for years. The meeting was packed. Neighbors who hadn't attended in years suddenly felt compelled to show up, pulled by a mix of anxiety and curiosity. HOA Karen took the front like a magistrate, seated beneath the association seal, flanked by board members who avoided eye contact with the audience. Even then, you could feel the imbalance. The room wasn't unified behind her. It was waiting. People didn't know for what, but they knew something was coming. Power that relies on intimidation always creates that kind of tension when it's challenged. She opened with rehearsed outrage, describing violations in abstract terms without names, painting a picture of chaos that only she could contain. She spoke about property values, legal exposure, and bad actors who refused to cooperate. Each phrase was crafted to isolate, to make dissent feel dangerous. And then she said my address out loud. Not my name at first, just the property. A tactic meant to dehumanize. Reduce the target to a line item. That was when I stood up. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't raise my voice. I waited for the pause she always left for applause that never quite came. Then I spoke, calmly, clearly, and without asking permission. I introduced myself by name, not as a homeowner, but as someone who had spent decades dismantling financial crimes committed by people who thought rules existed only for others. The room shifted immediately. Attention sharpened. Even HOA Karen's posture changed, though she tried to hide it. I didn't accuse her at first. Accusations trigger defensiveness. Instead, I asked questions. Simple ones. Where were the inspection reports for the emergency assessments? Why were contractors paid before work was verified? Why did enforcement apply unevenly across identical properties? Each question was anchored in a document. Each document was referenced by date and page number. I wasn't telling a story. I was reading a ledger. She tried to regain control by cutting me off, declaring the information confidential. That was her mistake. I calmly cited the statute that made it public. The audience murmured. A board member shifted uncomfortably. She escalated, accusing me of harassment. I responded by projecting the payment records onto the screen behind her. Large transfers, rounded figures, no itemization, no competing bids. Silence fell hard. Then I named the shell company. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. I explained its ownership structure, the familial connection, and the lack of operational capacity. I explained how funds moved from HOA accounts into private control. I didn't speculate. I demonstrated. People weren't reacting emotionally anymore. They were doing math in their heads. HOA Karen started shouting. But shouting sounds different when no one's listening. The collapse accelerated when I explained motive, the development filings, the access routes, the reason my property was suddenly a problem after decades of compliance. I laid out the sequence the way prosecutors do, not activists. Preparation, pressure, isolation, forced sale, profit. The room understood then. This wasn't about rules. It was about removal. HOA Karen attempted one final maneuver. She threatened legal action, defamation, injunctions. Words she had used to end conversations for years. They fell flat. Someone in the back laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. That laugh was the end of her authority. Once fear breaks, it never reforms the same way. I finished by stating one fact, that everything presented had already been preserved, duplicated, and shared with parties outside the room. That this meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was a record. And that any further retaliation would only expand it. I sat down. She stood there, exposed, scrambling through papers that no longer mattered. The board adjourned without a vote. People left in silence, not the fearful kind, but the processing kind. HOA Karen remained at the front, alone, her tools useless now that everyone could see what they were for. Her power didn't end that night. It collapsed in public, and once a collapse is witnessed, it becomes permanent. The retaliation phase didn't look like revenge, because revenge is emotional and loud, and emotion is the fastest way to lose control of a case. What followed was professional, procedural, and absolutely devastating. HOA Karen had spent years abusing informal power, assuming no one would ever escalate beyond complaints and attorney's letters. She had never faced someone who understood escalation as a science rather than a reaction. I didn't respond to her collapse by pressing harder in public. I responded by activating systems she had spent her entire reign avoiding. Within 48 hours of the meeting, formal complaints were filed, not as grievances, but as structured referrals. Financial irregularities were packaged into clean, chronological reports. Conflict of interest evidence was delivered with statutory annotations. Selective enforcement patterns were mapped visually, so even a board auditor could understand them at a glance. This wasn't a pile of accusations. It was a turnkey case file, the kind regulators dream of receiving because it saves them months of work and eliminates uncertainty. The first pressure point was financial oversight. HOAs exist in a gray zone where most people don't realize how exposed they actually are to audit authority. I knew exactly where that exposure lived. Requests for review were sent to agencies that don't negotiate, don't posture, and don't warn targets before acting. Accounts were flagged. Reporting failures surfaced. Missing disclosures suddenly mattered in ways HOA Karen could no longer spin. The money flow that had sustained her control slowed, then stalled. At the same time, land use regulators were quietly looped in, not with emotional stories, but with maps, easements, and contradictions between filings. Once development interests intersect with protected land, scrutiny becomes automatic. Questions get asked that no HOA president can answer away with bylaws. That scrutiny didn't announce itself. It just arrived, methodical and relentless, eroding every assumption she had about jurisdiction. HOA Karen attempted countermeasures, cease and desist letters, emergency board sessions, social media statements framed as victimhood. None of it landed. Each move only generated more documentation, more timestamps, more evidence of retaliatory behavior. The difference now was that she wasn't acting in the dark. Every action she took was being logged in contexts she couldn't control. What broke her wasn't a single authority. It was convergence, financial oversight intersecting with land regulation, governance violations intersecting with civil liability, internal dissent intersecting with external review. She had built her power by keeping those worlds separate. Expert retaliation collapses silos. Once they touch, momentum becomes inevitable. Neighbors began receiving official notices not from the HOA, but from the state. Requests for statements, invitations to submit documentation. People who had been silent for years suddenly had safe channels to speak. Fear drains quickly when legitimacy appears. HOA Karen found herself isolated not by confrontation, but by process. The irony was precise. She had relied on complexity to intimidate others, assuming no one would ever take the time to understand it. In the end, complexity became the instrument that dismantled her. Every clause she misused, every authority she overclaimed, every shortcut she took now existed as proof of intent rather than ambiguity. By the time formal enforcement actions became visible, the outcome was already decided. Retaliation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It moved through filings, reviews, and statutory triggers that don't care who you think you are. And HOA Karen, for the first time, had no mechanism left to stop it. The end didn't arrive with sirens or shouting, because real endings almost never do. It arrived quietly, in envelopes, in notices posted without ceremony, in meetings that were suddenly cancelled without explanation. HOA Karen didn't announce her defeat, because people like her never do. They simply vanish from the places where they once demanded attention. One week she was issuing directives. The next, her emails went unanswered. Then they stopped coming altogether. The first visible sign was administrative. The HOA website went offline, for maintenance, and never came back. Bank access was frozen pending review. Board members resigned in staggered silence, each citing personal reasons, none willing to attach their name to what was now clearly radioactive. The emergency powers HOA Karen had invented for herself evaporated the moment an external authority questioned their legitimacy. Power built on intimidation collapses instantly once scrutiny replaces fear. Then came the formal outcomes. Not dramatic, but final. Findings, orders, restrictions. The association was placed under oversight, its governance stripped down to bare compliance until it could be rebuilt without her. Financial controls were imposed. Past actions were flagged for remediation. Fines issued under her authority were suspended, then reversed. Liens dissolved. Letters went out correcting the record without ever mentioning her name. History was erasing her quietly. She tried once to reassert herself. A message circulated, half apology, half accusation, framed as misunderstanding. It went nowhere. No replies, no support. The audience she had relied on was gone. People who once nodded along now avoided her entirely. Isolation finished what exposure started. Control requires witnesses. She had none left. The development proposal that had driven everything met its own end shortly after. Without access, without cooperation, without political cover, it was withdrawn as non-viable. The land remained untouched. The lake stayed quiet. My cabin stayed where it had always been, anchored by law older and stronger than her ambition. The motive that fueled her campaign dissolved without ceremony. Neighbors returned to themselves. Not triumphant, just relieved. Conversations resumed without glances over shoulders. Meetings became boring again. That's how you know something is fixed. There were no speeches, no victory laps, just a normalcy reasserting itself where fear used to live. As for HOA Karen, her name stopped being spoken, not out of kindness, but out of irrelevance. She had built her identity on authority, and once it was gone, there was nothing left for people to reference. No one argued with her, no one challenged her, no one needed to. The system she abused had finally closed around her, and it did so without spectacle. I didn't celebrate. I went back to my routine, mornings by the water, evenings in silence. The same life she tried to disrupt, unchanged by her failure. Victory doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like peace returning to a place it never should have left. HOA, under Karen, went silent.